Hello, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this episode, I talk to someone who probably needs no introduction, Michael Bierut. Michael, of course, is a partner at Pentagram in New York, where he's worked since 1990 and has worked with clients from the New York Times to Hillary Clinton to Verizon to the MIT Media Lab. But in this conversation, we actually don't talk about his design work very much, but spend a lot of time talking about writing. Michael has done a lot of writing throughout his career. In 2003, he co-founded Design Observer and helped edit the anthologies of design writing Looking Closer, which are some really seminal texts on graphic design. This conversation meant a lot to me personally. As I mentioned at the beginning to Michael, Design Observer was very influential in my introduction to the field of graphic design, and Michael was one of the first designers that I was really conscious of when I was in high school and thinking about entering this profession. In fact, I'm pretty sure that Michael's book, 79 Short Essays on Design, was the first design book that I ever read. So to meet him and spend time with him over a decade later was really special for me. In this conversation, we talk about the origins of Design Observer and how he thought about writing. We talk about the awareness that the public has around graphic design and how that has changed the design process and the state of design writing. And then we also talk about the type of writing that he would like to see more of, kind of around the design process. It is well known that Michael is a great conversationalist and one of the smartest designers working today, and I really think that this conversation is no exception. It was really fun and interesting and thoughtful, and I am more than grateful for the time I got to spend with him and talk about these things. So let's get right into it. This is my interview with the great Michael Bierut. It's funny, I was actually thinking on my way over here, I kind of discovered graphic design about 12, 13 years ago when I was, I think, like a sophomore in high school or so. And I grew up in suburban Pennsylvania, and I had never met a real graphic designer before.
Yeah.
And so this was like 2002, 2003. And so it was kind of like the start of design blogs.
Yeah.
And so that was like my first introduction to graphic design was through these blogs. And so my kind of like initial reaction of what a graphic designer is, in addition to someone who makes images and deals with typography, was also somebody who like writes and thinks about their work and talks about what it means in culture. Right. And so that's always been something that's kind of like been very much a part of how I even think about what I do. But what I realized as I was on my way over here is that obviously Design Observer was kind of one of those first ones that I read, and your writing was on there. And so you are one of a group of designers that I kind of knew as a young high school kid, but knew you through your writing first before I ever consciously saw your work.
Right.
And so I was kind of curious, is like how, because I'm kind of coming to your work from the opposite way, how'd your kind of writing practice, how did you start writing about design?
Let's see. I mean, I think that designers have always liked talking and thinking about design. You know, if you got together with other designers, you would talk about it, and the talking and thinking used to have a kind of intense desperation to it because, sort of in the year, even 10 years before and 20 years before you made your discovery, graphic design was, no one knew what it was, and no one was expected to know what it was. And if you tried to explain what it was, you couldn't make anyone understand or care what you were explaining, right? So if you would find someone else who did what you did, it was really this delirious moment of community you could have talking about the, all the trivia and esoterica associated with graphic design. There weren't that many outlets for writing, but pre-blogs, pre-internet, there were like the design magazines, some of which were interested in writing. There was, places like Emigre and I that grew up in the late 80s and into the 90s. took writing really seriously, and I particularly was a real fan of and I was particularly a real fan of the way that Rick Poynter wrote. And I remember I remember reading him when he was a writer for he used to write for an architectural tabloid called Blueprint in the UK. And what I liked about his writing was it was that peculiarly British way of assuming that the audience kind of had a certain amount of, was bringing a certain amount of knowledge of the reader was bringing about a certain amount of knowledge of his or her own to the text you were writing. Right. That you didn't have to qualify everything, that you could just sort of like make allusions and count on people's ability to keep up, right? And it's actually kind of like, it's if you're talking about, and it also had a lively kind of character too. And I remember reading like The Painted Word by Tom Wolfe, or some of Tom Wolfe's other essays that touch on design. Even like, Vroom Vroom, There Goes That Candy-Coated Tangerine Baby, the book about, the essay he wrote about stock car racing, the one that actually launched its career as a quote-unquote new journalist, is really design criticism. I mean, he's talking about the culture that kind of created the world of customized sports cars and what motivated those people to do, and did it from a sociological point of view, did it from an anthropological point of view, did it with a real keen appreciation of the design work and the artwork that those guys were creating. And I remember thinking, this is a way to write about design that I really like, And what I didn't like, what I always thought was like just tedious were kind of the alternatives in those days in design magazines were either profiles of would-be famous designers, that would have accounts of the appearance of their studio and kind of recorded without comment, statements of intention by the subject of the profile, not subjected to any kind of critical view at all. And then things that passed for kind of higher level kind of critical analytical pieces always had this he said, she said sort of quality. I will find 5 people to interview on the subject of technology and design, and then just say, on the other hand, Jared feels that technology might be good, and it's like, and the writer has no opinion whatsoever. It's just sort of the receptacle of all these views, right? So, in the early aughts, I got contacted by Bill Drentel and Jessica, and they said they were starting a blog. I barely knew what blogs were. Armin Witt was there first with Speak Up, and which was sort of a little bit of a kind of, it was very much in the community bulletin board thing. Except Armin actually is a good writer and a good editor, and also, as when I read Armin, I knew him primarily as a writer, and discovered only later that he actually did design work too. Oh, interesting. Yeah, so that was a really common experience. Mariam Banshee's another person like that.
That's a great example.
Yeah, and so when these blogs started up, suddenly there was this outlet for publishing writing on design that had a lot of, for me, really appealing characteristics. Having written for, it's commissioned by Steve Heller and Shee Perlman and Rick Poynter to write respectively for AIJ Journal or ID Magazine or and you would write a piece. They'd commission the piece, you'd write it, you'd submit it to them. After a period of time, it would be published. And then perhaps someone would acknowledge that they had read it, right? And like the period of time could feel like weeks and sometimes stretch into months. And it was also kind of, it was a chore because you agreed to do it, then you'd put it off. I'm not an enthusiastic writer. I don't like to do it.
Oh, really?
I find it really painful and aggravating, and I try, I just don't like doing it. I like having done it. I like when I'm really pleased with myself when I finish writing something, but like the prospect of having to write something ruins my life actually, and I really don't like it.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I'm told that's why I used to say I'm not like a real writer. I really hate doing it. I just procrastinate all the time. But I've talked to enough editors to learn that many writers had that characteristic, oddly enough. when Bill and Jessica said that they were going to do this blog that was going to be called Design Observer with Rick Pointer, I sort of thought, well, this could be fun. And then I just got into it. And I had this 3-4 year period where I was really prolific. And it was a great period to be doing this because there was enough people doing it that there was an audience, but there was still few enough people doing it that you could have whatever subject you picked, you could sort of have it to yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember the very first thing that I wrote in Design Observer was a piece about the New York Times standardizing on Cheltenham for their headline.
I remember
font.
that. Yeah, I read that.
And I remember they did it like on a Tuesday, and I think I wrote my piece on the following weekend, and it got published about a week later. I suspect if the New York Times did that now, there would be, forget about the design blogs, forget about, an interview with the art director that would be done by, Fastco Design or Wired or It's Nice That or Dezeen or, Ion Design or whoever, that would be something that Gothamist or Gawker or Slate, would jump on and sort of like, and they just would, and they would be on it like that day, and with snarky things, with deeper things, with whatever things. And so, but in those days though, it was like, you would write this stuff and you sort of thought no one has ever, I would write things and I would think, I think no one's ever written about this stuff before, and not that I thought I was a genius and I was kind of like coming up with completely unique ideas, but my assumption was that here's something that I think is interesting. I have evidence that I've talked to several people who pretend that it's interesting, and we'll just publish this and see whether several more people would think that it's interesting. And I remember watching in those days our weekly views like kind of went from 1,500 to 2,000, 3,000, 5,000, 10, 20, until we were getting 250,000 weekly views, Wow. And it happened like, it was like a spike straight up. And then, and I have to admit, it probably it hit a ceiling and didn't go much beyond that afterwards. And I sort of, me, Jessica, Bill, and Rick had this, we took that, we were the only people writing for Design Observer then, and if there was nothing new going up, I remember I would just send around emails, so I'll write something and have it ready tomorrow morning before I even knew what it was. I just would come up with something.
Because you wanted like this constant
just to make
stream.
it happen, And that ended up being really fun. It was, I sort of managed to, almost in the first piece, to I remember Jessica saying, just pretend you're writing a letter to, an educated, an informed friend who shares your enthusiasms. And I was able to then kind of like get the tone of voice that I admired, slightly sassy the way that Tom Wolfe was, although I'm no Tom Wolfe, and slightly knowing the way that a British, kind of cultural journalist like Pointer writes, and that The Guardian has dozens of these writers, as does much of the British press, but that's sort of like, not being afraid to be erudite and not feeling you have to go qualify every one of your references. You can just say Baskerville, you don't have to say John Baskerville, the 18th century British type designer,
So would you say that kind of writing for Design Observer was your education in writing? Like, it sounds like you hadn't done that much.
I hadn't done that much. I mean, I wrote things before that I was proud of. I was a good writer. I think I honestly received my education of a writer was received at the hands of a lady named Linda Wagey back when I was in the 11th grade, to tell you the truth. I sort of learned, she taught me how to write. She was a really, really good English teacher.
So you've always been
and I was enthusiastic about it. But what was great about writing for the blog was, one, you weren't getting assigned anything, so there was no obligation to someone else to do something. You would just volunteer, and then it was on you to do it, and then I would just sit down and do it. Two, you wouldn't have to wait 3 months to see it published. You just would literally press a button. We all edited ourselves. There was no central editor, and we just would, each of us would like literally press publish, and then the thing would be published. And then three, you would get immediate feedback. Those were the days where comment strings could go on for 20, 30, 40, 100, 200 comments, you know?
And they're not like
stupid.
Yeah, they're not like YouTube comments today. Every now and then I'll like go and look back at like old Design Observer
it was
comments, and it's like a real discussion.
Yeah, no, you could hit on something depending on what it was. And, you know, I remember there was this notorious one that I wrote that actually got heavily trolled in the comments, but it was about kind of either plagiarism or appropriation of style, and I used as an example a student portfolio I saw that looked like it was unconsciously or subconsciously or unwittingly ripping off Barbara Kruger.
I remember that.
And there were like at least, you know, one anonymous commenter and one well-known commenter who were taking turns kind of hijacking the thread in a way. And I was famous for like not caring about the comments. I just thought, you know, I didn't care how many comments I got, and I didn't care. I thought it was nice to get interesting comments, but I thought, you know, unless you're going to go in and police the comments, you know, moderate the comments all day long, you know, I don't want to do that. I'm not sure what principle I'd have to do that.
Yeah.
And so we just let it run. But then finally, it seemed to be going, you know, so that was one of the few times we actually shut a thread down. Just
really?
Going,
For the Barbara Kruger piece?
Yeah, if you read it to the end, you'll see that, like, you know, finally we shut it down. And then people are like really pissed that it's being like shut down, you know. So
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And it was just that like the other, you know, I sort of didn't care, but there were other Design Observer, the other three people to various degrees just found the whole thing kind of like distracting and aggravating.
That's so interesting.
But that doesn't happen anymore. But I mean, Armin will get on brand new.
Yeah.
If people are kind of arguing about a new logo, but there's something almost guaranteed about that subject where it's not possible to have any conversation of substance about it just by the nature of what it is, compounded by the fact that people, you know, in the age of Twitter and 140 characters, et cetera, just don't have the capacity to have prolonged arguments and
that's something actually that I wanted to talk to you about, because you wrote, I think it was in 2013, your graphic design criticism as a spectator sport, which I actually can't even remember what the logo of that time that was kind of like the big deal. Tropicana.
Tropicana was much before, and then I think probably the thing that was there is probably University of California system logo.
That's right.
That probably was the thing, and that wasn't even that recent. It was that had happened months before, and so this was like a real kind of New York Review of Books style, much after the fact, thumb-sucking analytical piece, you know.
But it's funny because I reread it as I was kind of preparing for like some of these interviews that I'm doing, and it feels like the kind of culture that you were commenting on has only gotten worse and gotten bigger in this kind of hot take, snap judgment. And worse immediately. As soon as I said worse, I realized that puts like a kind of value judgment on it, and I don't mean it like that. But the issue that you were commenting on is bigger, and it's like you were saying is like, you know, Slate and Fast Company, and now we'll write about every logo redesign. And I don't know if there's a question here, but it's interesting to think about that now in relation to you saying kind of when you started with Design Observer and you thought maybe like a couple people would care.
Yeah.
How has that changed? How is that, like, there's more discourse around design than ever.
Yeah.
How has that changed, A, how you practice, if at all, and then also how you write about it? Because I'm thinking of the one you wrote recently about the Met.
Well, I think having wrote out that first wave that had a really unique and probably destined to be unprecedented sort of context. You know, when I write now, a lot of times it'll be just this thing I think about like literally for weeks and weeks.
Yeah.
And finally think, you know, I think I've got an angle on this, and I'm just going to slowly put it down. And I'd been kind of thinking for a long time about the subjects that were in that design criticism of the spectator sport thing. And then the one about the Met logo was sort of a second, what had as much to do, you know, I used the Met logo as the case study, but I could just as easily think about work that I had done, whether it was the Hillary Clinton logo or the Verizon logo that was subjected to the same sort of criticism.
Yeah.
And just this kind of sense that I had that. Well, I actually don't. Honestly, Jared, if someone would have told me, back when I was discovering this thing that barely had a name, graphic design, when I was in high school, but I started caring about typefaces and logos and stuff like that, and no one knew what I was talking about, and I didn't know another living person who cared about this stuff. I'd never met anyone else who cared about it. If someone would have told me that thing, hey Mike, that thing that you really are interested in, that no one really understands, in 40 years, it's going to be talked about like sports or or celebrity gossip. People will be expected to have an opinion about like the Google logo.
Yeah,
and
I love your response. Was it Fast Company that asked you to comment on it, and you were just like, I'm not doing this.
Well, I don't comment on other people's logos anymore because I think it's just is having been subjected to it, and it's just there's no upside to it. I will say that if we want a more if you want to toil in obscurity, for whatever reason, that's okay. I don't think you can anymore, but that's a thing to yearn for. If you want nothing but informed criticism, you're living on the wrong planet and you're part of the wrong species. And I think if you think what we do has enough significance that people should care about it, you kind of can't be that picky about the nature that concern assumes, if you ask me. I think that I'll say, as long as you have a little bit of distance on it, the biggest danger if you're a practitioner is that your clients are ill prepared for what happens, but they've learned fast as far as that goes. We launched a logo yesterday. Yeah. Oh, right. And my clients were we had pre-briefed. Between their marketing people and us, we had pre-briefed at least a half dozen different websites and blogs. We're going to take you through this work and explain what we were thinking.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and so they really, these companies really are anticipating that, and they're able to ride out the good and the bad, and in the aftermath of it, people have been trading around some of the funnier, snarkier things that have come up, and it's like I'm like, thanks for, my attitude sincerely is interesting. You think that? Let me know if you design a financial institution logo that I can comment on. I'll be happy to let you know what I think. And like otherwise though, it's like most of them are just so a lot of it is so hopelessly ill-informed that you sort of can't take it seriously. Or in the case of doing a logo for a politician, the criticism is, it's doing exactly what symbols are supposed to do. It's representing a larger idea, and people are commenting on shapes and colors, and really that is just a way for them to express their like, or more likely, given the way the internet works, dislike for the thing that the symbol represents.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting of kind of almost pre-briefing news organizations about a rebrand, and how in the last couple of years the rebrand has become this event. Almost like an Apple keynote. Where it's like, you notify all the press.
And I can remember the idea that like people would give you the time of day. It's like, I remember there was it wasn't that long ago where the idea that like anyone would care at all, they just would think it was preposterous. Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on the way the kind of general public, like not designers, but everyone else comments and reacts to those things? And is there some sort of, I don't know how to say this without it sounding really kind of like pretentious, but education around since we're talking about rebrands, like why a change has been made and that it's often more than just kind of like a surface or a decoration.
Yeah, and I think that part of the problem is even when I get into that stuff, like you just said, you worry about feeling pretentious. Like part of it is like, these things don't go out chaperoned by me or anyone else explaining them as they're introduced, introducing them and explaining what they're about. They go out there and they do whatever work they do, and that's it. And like, in that essay that's called Swimming Not Diving, the point I wanted to make specifically that's unique, I think, to logos is that they're designed, if they're designed well, they're designed to acquire more and more meaning over time, and people, and that's the one thing that people, I think it's just really hard for people to understand that. It's really hard for people to understand that when they look at the old Met logo, there's nothing, that logo does have specific characteristics, but the physical characteristics of that logo are overwhelmed by that logo's association with actual lived experience that the viewer has had with the institution itself, right? And you just come to associate it with that logo, right? And then someone changes it, and it just kind of seems like, oh my God, what have you done? This new thing means nothing, and it's stupid and ugly and everything else, and it's and it's not, you can say, oh, you shouldn't do ligatures like that, or those serifs just seem exaggerated, or that's not how I would have done it. But, the question really is, does this thing have the capacity to acquire the meaning over time that its predecessor did? And often, I think it's actually really hard to judge. And I don't think we're passing the buck with these things, but, it's right to have, I think people are entitled to have opinions about them. And I think sort of the, particularly, this week's logo launch, some of the funniest, snarkiest comments actually were people commenting on the culture of commenting on logo launches, it's like someone had a Twitter thing that was like, open screen door, kids, MasterCard has a new logo, hurry in, and coming mom, it's like, they were just on,
I didn't see that.
Yeah, it was something, I misquoted it, but it was something like that. And I think that people are getting, these wisecracky people who tend to lead the way, particularly on Twitter, are getting more savvy about it. And the clients are getting more savvy about it. They're learning to kind of ride it out and not freak out if someone doesn't like their new logo, And I don't think, I think that a lot of the reaction is destined to be inevitable, and then it's also destined to be yoked slightly to what the logo, the nature of the thing it represents. If it's, the Met, people have strong personal feelings about the Met. They are, if it's a big corporation, sometimes they have strong personal feelings of dislike towards the corporation, in which case any new logo will just be more evidence of how awful that thing they hate is. And then sometimes, like a financial services or credit card company, it's like your feelings are a little bit more neutral, and so it's harder to kind of get an angle on how you would criticize what they are. I mean, Google or Instagram or Uber, these are things that people have in the case of Google, you may encounter that logo. You may be encountering that brand and using that brand and seeing that, dozens of times a day. Uber, if you're an Uber user, likewise Instagram, if you're a passionate Instagram user, you're using that all the time. So you feel really personally about those things. And when it changes, it's sort of like waking up to find, that someone's rearranged all the furniture in your house.
Right. When you think about your writing, or when you're writing critically, like the Swimming Not Diving piece, does that, how much of that, this question is going to be incredibly reductive, but how much of that is like related to kind of like the work that you're doing day to day as a designer?
Oh no, it's a good question, and I think for a few of us, Michael Rock is another one, Debbie might be another one, Jessica sort of is. If you're a working designer, and you're also trying to write critically about design. It's a tricky thing to do, and I was very, very conscious of it when I was writing really regularly for Design Observer. There were certain, the whole time I wrote for Design Observer, not the whole time I wrote for Design, but in the initial kind of like 4 years that I did most of the writing that then appeared in 79 short essays on design. I think of those 79 essays, I think I refer to work that I actually was doing myself maybe less than 5 times. Like almost never. Partly because I wanted to, sometimes I just didn't think it was appropriate for me to be talking about my own projects. Partly because I wanted readers not to be reminded of the fact that I wasn't trying to conceal it exactly, but I was trying to make people engage with the ideas and not have to feel like I was, step into my studio and let me tell you how I do it, kids. Right. I wanted them to sort of like I wanted to kind of take my own, I wanted to take those distractions away and let the ideas be there. I was also kind of trying to push myself and just say, look, the world of design and the way it's practiced has to, I was looking for things that were just bigger than anecdotes that I was bringing to the table, I remember in that design criticism and spectator sport thing was like the first time, we had redesigned the Big Ten logo, and we had tried for years for like this insanely prolonged period to redesign the UPS logo. And I mentioned both those things, and each of those were, particularly UPS. That was like, I remember when Future Brand actually successfully succeeded us on that account and managed to redesign the logo for them. I remember just sitting on my hands and thinking, there's all kinds of interesting things I could say about this that I just don't think it's appropriate for me to say because I'm a working practitioner, and I think for any number of reasons it will sound like sour grapes. It'll sound like sniping. It's betraying client confidences. You really are inhibited if you're on the inside a little bit. And I used to tell Rick Pointer that he and I would talk, and I would say, look, I'm sorry, I end up pulling a lot of punches. I really do. I won't go directly at one of my competitors, no matter how much I dislike the work they've done or how much I even disapprove of the way they behaved in any one instance. I just don't think I think it's unseemly. It's ungentlemanly, if I can be old-fashioned about it, And also I think Design Observer particularly, and specifically had, without any real forethought about it, kind of had a sort of faintly cerebral tone to it. There were very few pieces that, like, my cat did something funny today. They were all of them sort of to a degree that irritated some people. I assume kind of aspired to this sort of like mountaintop view of shit. And I think I leavened it with short words that people would use in conversation. I always really tried to make it sound like, again, I was talking to a friend about this stuff as opposed to delivering an academic paper at a conference.
We're starting to get a little short on time, so I'll start kind of wrapping it up a little bit. But when you were writing those pieces, I like this idea of like kind of writing to a friend. Did you have an audience in mind? And I feel like you're more interesting than some of the other people that I've talked to, and some people that I'm still going to talk to, in that. In my opinion, most of your writing is for other designers also, and kind of for the design community, and the profession kind of at large. Would you say would you agree with that?
Yeah, it was funny. It was a little bit of a line to walk because I didn't want to. It's not as true now because people are much more informed than they are. But there was a period where anytime, those rare occasions where graphic design or graphic designers kind of like would be mentioned in the popular press. it always had an element of, gee, can you believe this? Can you believe people do something like this for a living?
Yeah.
Isn't that odd?
When I interviewed Stephen Heller, he said that he would often. The reason he liked writing obituaries is because he liked letting people know that there were people that were kind of over here doing this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I remember there was an article and then a long thread on Speak Up, because after the very good New Yorker writer Alex Wilkinson, I think is his name, wrote a profile of the eminence Greece of American type design, Matthew Carter.
Oh, yeah.
And like a lot of people who read it on Speak Up didn't like it because they thought, it was really boring. And what they weren't noticing was what was hard. I remember saying, guys, the New Yorker, you're not going to get this like detailed breakdown of Matthew Carter in the New Yorker because it's being read mostly by people who have no idea that typefaces are designed by human beings who walk among us to this day, and that there's some sort of thing involved with that. So just getting the basic foundations of the story out is like going to occupy almost most of the article. Not what makes Matthew Carter different from Susanna Lichko. And so I would say that I did try to write. When I would write things, I try to write them so that I could picture someone who wasn't a designer reading it and following along. But they'd have to sort of like be predisposed to be interested in this sort of thing on some level. And I also, but I would say, this is going to sound corny and kind of pandering, but I mean, I was writing it for you, basically. I remember thinking there was one piece of writing, and it's like a paragraph long, and I remember it's Tom Wolfe, and Tom Wolfe was asked one year to be a judge at a competition at AIGA.
Okay.
And he wrote comments about the things that he was judging, and one of them was about this abstract logo for a company. He wrote the funniest damn thing I've ever read. It was so funny. It was like, a bunch of kind of like the dependent clauses just running on and saying, and it was so slangy and sassy and like, snarky, I guess, before that was really a thing. And I just remember thinking, this is how writing about design should be. It's just so funny and sharp and in your face. And I just thought, I wasn't even trying to elevate the discourse. I just wanted it to be interesting,
Right.
And I remember thinking, if I could just write some things that some kid in Ohio who was just discovering graphic design and sort of thought, is this intimidating, confusing thing that has mysteries behind it? Or is it this fun thing that actually connects up in all these different ways to life as I understand it, just as someone who watches TV and goes to movies and, looks at the box of cereal as I'm eating it? How does graphic design relate to that?
Right.
And I remember thinking that I just want to write those kind of stories so that someone who, if there's some dad out there who can tell his son or daughter is kind of slightly interested in this stuff, they would see this thing and kind of like forward it on to them. I think you'd like this. That was who my audience was. I never I wouldn't have thought. I had a period where I never minded kind of like snarky, slangy, kind of quote unquote uninformed writing about design. The thing I really hated was this kind of binge that happened around there that was about intensely academic writing that started happening. That just was, and I'm told that I'm wrong by people I respect. So with a grain of salt, but I just remember like reading these things that just I could not decipher. And what always bothered me about them too was that there was always like an absent subject in all of them. They were talking about graphic design on some level, but never, they talk about, the gendered gaze of some, and of something. And as Derrida said it's like, are you, and I just remember Tom Wolfe doing this really funny commentary on the cult of abstract logos, and it just was like bang, it was like fantastic. And instead this stuff was just kind of like slathered all over everything and kind of sounded like you could hum along with it along with other academic writing you had read, and it sort of sounded like the same basic tune, but didn't really mean anything that I could fathom. It certainly didn't add to my understanding of what design was.
I love that you brought this up right at the end, because actually, because I could talk about that for another 2 hours, but it also is a perfect setup for what my last two questions were going to be for you. And we didn't plan this, so it was perfect. My first question is kind of like, what kind of, as we were saying, there's like more talk around design than ever. What do you think is lacking in that discussion, whether it's like a subject or an issue or a kind of type of writing or an audience that needs to be hit?
I think it's a couple of things, and I don't think it's lacking in. I'd have trouble identifying its absence entirely unless I had seen instances of it that I just would like to see more of.
Okay.
So for instance,
that's it.
Alexandra Lang just wrote this essay in Curbed about the Four Seasons, and it's beautiful. Yeah. It's just sensational. It's both really well reported. I mean, it's like she really did her homework on it. It starts out with a personal story about her grandfather. It's sort of it's emotional because she's trying to communicate this sense of familiarity with a beloved place, which now is going to basically be forever changed. And so it has that element too, and it actually makes this really kind of powerful case for what those kind of places can mean. And it does it with this like kind of like absolute mastery, where she's not falling back just on, there's a lot of stories we've heard about the Four Seasons, and I would, if I was like a normal person, I'd be bored with it. I'm like, fuck the Four Seasons and everything that's ever eaten there. It's like, I don't want to care about this, and why is this a thing, And instead, she wrote it in a way that was really original and went deep on the actual subject matter of it. So I think what's there that's, there's a couple of things that's there that you don't find enough of. One is that she's able to admit to and own sort of the emotional effect that design has. And in so doing, that's also admitting about the unquantifiable effect that it has, the subjective effect that it has. I think that Jessica's whole book is basically about that, her new book, right? The Invention of Desire. And so that was really refreshing and important. And, there's there's writers I really admire who somehow just either factor that out because they're not allowed to kind of get to that, or it just seems too arbitrary or something else. Secondly, she really did do her homework, and she's not just sort of like assuming blah 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 Philip Johnson, blah blah blah, pool room, grill room, blah blah blah, Phyllis Lambert, Bronfman, blah, Mies van der Rohe, kind of reiterating all these like kind of like things that we can all recite about the place. She actually really went in and looked at the details, and as a graphic designer, of course, I appreciated the way she looked at the details of those darn menus and everything else. But I mean, it wasn't just that; it was really impressive. So I think that's one thing, and I think the other thing is, Lorraine Wild, who's also, I think, is someone who is in your category, people.
I want to talk to her.
Lorraine wrote this beautiful essay called "Castles Made of Sand," I think, that you should track down, because in it she talks about, and I was very surprised. I wasn't expecting it to be about that, but she talks about sort of the context in which design is actually made. And how inconvenient it is, how hard it is to report that and to research that and to memorialize that, and how convenient it is just to ascribe, I mean, people just will default to, there is this designer, and that designer just did this series of, done this series of things, and you can look at it as a body of work, and this is the best stuff, and this is not quite as good, and there's this, that, and the other thing. And designers kind of like, one of the things that makes design so great, one of the things that make graphic design specifically so great, is that it's really like a social activity. You can't go off by yourself and be a designer. Well, I guess you can, but the reason I became a designer is because I'm too social or too terrified of loneliness or too I lack the confidence simply to go off and just sort of like, paint canvases that I think are bringing to life some unique vision I have that the world needs to share. I mean, I don't have any of that within me at all. What I can do is have someone come to me and say, look, we've had this logo for 20 years, it hasn't been changed, and X, Y, and Z, and I can kind of get into that, and so call me, I'm just, I'm a vendor, I admit it. And so, so that means that all of the interactions that I have happen within this web of relationships. The way the client comes to me, what their expectations are, what the frustrations are along the way, and that's it's edited completely out of history, know. And then every once in a while you'll get this fascinating glimpse of it. Sometimes there's a big coffee table book about, I think, Elliot Noyes, the Connecticut-based industrial designer, who really kind of was, in post-war America was kind of had a Zelig sort of ubiquity among...
At IBM for a while?
IBM, Mobile, Westinghouse. He was like the go-to guy. And so he was with Saarinen, he's with Ivan Shemaev, he's with... all these other guys, and sort of, and it's sort of like you really get a sense of who his enablers were, who his patrons were, what their motivations were, what they were trying to accomplish. So like there's a social history to design that is really easy to miss, and once it's missed, it disappears.
Right. That's
and I think certainly in other art forms, biographies. I mean, read. Wallace Stevens has biographers. Kind of record, trying to fathom his every move, what compelled him to write this poem or that poem, and how did he revise them, and what was he doing, and where was he walking home, and who did he work for, and everything else. And meanwhile, these designs were just sort of, this thing came from somewhere, and here's the credit, and hooray,
It's a perfect. I almost want to end it there, but I have one more question.
So I like both those things, and I think, but they both require lots of work. And Alexandra is she's got unpublished shit. Like her PhD stuff is. Yeah,
she told me a little bit about it.
It's just great. I mean, it's like eating candy to read.
To just kind of wrap everything up because we're short on time. What do you think? And it kind of relates to that last question. Is what do you think design writing and design criticism and theory? What is its value in the profession? Kind of like in the current state, not as like a necessarily as like a history marker, but as kind of like work that's being put out today and writing being put out today. What value does that add?
Okay, I'll improvise an answer to that I'm not sure is the answer.
Okay. And I know it's a setup because it's assuming that there is a value. Part of this.
Well,
project
I'll tell you one value it has. I'm not sure this is the most important one or the only one. The thing that's fascinating about design, it goes to what I was just saying about it being a social activity. It's a really complex activity, and you learn about only one part of it when you're in design school. And it's hard to learn. It's hard to actually master a craft and acquire the facility it takes to to be an architect or a product designer or a graphic designer or any of these things, right? It requires really hard work and practice to get good at it on whatever terms you've defined as good, right? Then, when you go into the world and you start practicing in real life, if you're talking about the professional world, there's all this stuff that you couldn't have been, that's not possible to teach in school, and then for years, sort of like war stories about stupid clients were sort of like passed from hand to hand, and those were like those sort of like defined the terms of what discourse was, it was sort of like, clients are stupid and you have to trick them into picking the design that you are trying to sell, or sometimes you find someone who will let you do whatever you want and they're like the best, It's like there's like sort of these like incredibly simplistic formulations that are like, that are no more sophisticated than the seating arrangements at some fourth grader's birthday party. They sort of like know anything, And I think it's like, so it's not just about clients, but it's about how work lives in the world and how it's perceived and how you actually do things. Now, I was lucky I lucked into getting a job with someone who was really super thoughtful and very generous with sharing his thinking, Massimo Vignelli.
Yeah.
And I worked for him right out of school, and I worked there for 10 years. And he and I actually have very different ideas about design and how it should be, how it can be practiced and everything else. We don't not ideas that we would fight about, or we sort of see each other's ideas as outright wrong. But I wasn't just a uncritical disciple of things that he wasn't, that the things he espoused or was enthusiastic about. But he was someone who actually would take design work and put it in a bigger context, sometimes talking about it really clearly and sometimes just by example, And I really learned a lot about design on all sorts of different levels, not just things that he did that I wanted to emulate, but just a way of thinking about things on a slightly higher level. And so, not everyone can work for Massimo Vignelli, and these days, lots of people can do design and they have to find their own way in it. So I think one of the things that design writing can contribute to is just creating a bigger base of knowledge about the world of design and what its potential is, right? And, so you could read, for instance, a piece that Alexandra Lang had written about the Four Seasons restaurant. You could read it just to be edified about, isn't that interesting, the Four Seasons restaurant, who would have thunk? Or you could also read it as, wow, to create kind of a place that would endure like that, what were the characteristics of it? Yeah. What am I getting from, what is she seeing there that I could, what lessons are there for my own work and my own ambitions if I share, if this is relevant? And so that would be relevant to someone's ambitions. Yeah. It would be completely irrelevant to someone else's. But I think it's a way to sort of learn from this body of, this world of activity that goes on all the time, that's been going on for decades and decades now, and that largely has been unrecorded. That goes back to Lorraine's essay, where she called it Castles Made of Sand, because she says it just, we do all this stuff and it all just blows away. And it's not just our work is ephemeral and gets recycled, it's that everything about these things sort of are ephemeral and get recycled,
Yeah, I love how that also just kind of brings us full circle, because, Design Observer and Speak Up were my kind of, they were my knowledge base before I had any kind of real knowledge of it. And so it's been really great to talk to you. It's really an honor.
Thank you, Jared.
Thank you for your time.
Good, my pleasure.
This episode was recorded on July 14th, 2016 at Pentagram's offices in New York City. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter at Surface Podcast. You can find us on iTunes and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.